Meet the Robinsons was Disney's 47th animated film, a story about the dangers and optimism of the future. A film whose theme, Keep Moving Forward, couldn't have been more prescient for the Walt Disney Company at the time. The company was in a state of flux. Its past with chairman Michael Eisner had been lucrative, but as of late, Eisner hadn't been producing like the days of old. In animation, the company had been surpassed by Pixar's visionary three-dimensional features that delighted critics and the public. Even DreamWorks had created bigger splashes than Disney of late, with Shrek. Disney was now looking towards the future and had fully abandoned its 2D animation division after a string of box office failures. Its crop of 3D movies so far, Dinosaur and Chicken Little, had done decently at the box office, but failed to establish an identity for a company that thrives on its identity and culture. Within these swirling times and shifting tides, director Steve Anderson was about to embark on a creative journey, fraught with unforeseen circumstances and cruel twists of fate that made Steve wonder if he could manage to keep moving forward. Steve Anderson, director, Meet the Robinsons.
I went to CalArts in 1988 and was there for about 3 years. And then kind of during those 3 years and after those 3 years, I got a job at a studio called Hyperion Animation. And that was my first industry job. The very first job I had at Hyperion was as an animating assistant on the classic animated film Rover Dangerfield. And then from there, I was an animator on a movie called Bebe's Kids. And then I got to do some storyboarding for the first time and some directing for the first time on some TV work that they were doing at Hyperion. And while I was there, I met Kevin Lima, who left Hyperion to do Goofy Movie and then ultimately do Tarzan. But because of meeting Kevin and getting along with him very well, and also Chris Buck, who was my animation teacher at CalArts, I was able to then move into Disney as a story artist. So I started at Disney in June of 1995, but I started on a Monday. That weekend was the Pocahontas wrap party, and then I think just a week or so later, Pocahontas was released. So I got there when the studio was on this massive high because they were just coming off of Lion King. Prior to that, it was Aladdin, then it was Beauty and the Beast, this sort of new renaissance. The studio was really riding that wave, and it felt like they could do no wrong. Well, you know, Pocahontas is a great movie. It did pretty well, but it did just slightly less than Lion King. And then every movie after that seemed to just do less and less and less and less. So I just got there in a really weird time where, you know, the purse strings tightened up a bit and people started getting a little bit worried that, oh, our movies seem to be dwindling in terms of public response. And yeah, we need to make some money. I think Mulan did pretty well, and then Tarzan did pretty well as well. Those were sort of some bright spots in there, but it was weird to get there right at the sort of the beginning of a huge dip in the studio's success. First, I started at Disney Features as a story artist on Tarzan, and I did about 3 years on Tarzan. It was kind of interesting because at the time, must have been maybe on like the last year of Tarzan, a guy named Mike Gabriel, very big name in Disney animation, started developing this Western idea called Sweating Bullets. Well, ultimately it became Home on the Range, but it was a very different movie at the time. And Mike had done all these amazing drawings of, I don't even know if he had a story. He was just drawing cowboys and Western towns and horses and guys with guns and cigarettes hanging out of their mouth. And I just was so captivated by it. And I thought, well, that's really what I want to do after Tarzan, is go work on this Sweating Bullets movie. And I met with Mike Gabriel, and Mike Giamo was also a co-director with Mike Gabriel. So I met with them and we had this good rapport, and I was like, that's the movie I really want to work on. I really connect to that. I connect to these guys. But the studio said, well, before you do that, we'd like you to kind of hop over onto this other movie, just help them out to get to a screening, just do some boards temporarily. And it was this movie called Kingdom of the Sun, which, as everyone knows, became Emperor's New Groove. And it was Roger Allers' vision of that version of the story. So I said, all right, fine, I'll help you out. And I helped out, did some boards. They had a screening, and I was assuming I was just going to then jump ship and go on to Sweating Bullets. Well, the screening that I helped out on was the screening, which, if you all know the Disney lore of Kingdom of the Sun, that was the screening where everything melted down and Roger was eventually taken off the project, and then Mark Dindal took over and it became Emperor's New Groove. Well, I sort of got caught up in that and I kept trying to get off and go work on Sweating Bullets, but I had a bunch of friends that were working on Kingdom, from what I remember hearing, and I say all this with great love for Roger Allers because he's an amazing individual and I respect him to death. So none of this is, I don't want any of this to sound like it's a personal attack on Roger, but from what I'd heard, I think that last screening where everything kind of melted down was maybe like their third or fourth screening, perhaps. And the impression that I got was that the studio leadership at the time, Peter Schneider and Tom Schumacher, had been giving Roger the same set of notes for each one of those screenings, and nothing was getting addressed. So they felt very much like this movie is stalling out. Roger is, for whatever reason, either reluctant to change things, unwilling to change things, or maybe thought he was changing things, but it just wasn't enough for them. So I think they essentially felt like this movie is flatlined, so we got to do something different with it. It was crazy because for this particular screening where everything kind of went to hell, they screened the movie downstairs and we went up to the story room like we usually do and gathered around the table. The story team and the director, the producer, the writers, Tom Schumacher and Peter Schneider, we all sat down, they closed the door, and then Tom just looked at everyone and said, "I want to thank all of you for your very hard work. Now, we'd like to ask you to leave, please." And we all sort of looked at each other in shock for a beat and then got up and left. And as soon as we got out of the room, we thought, oh, something bad is going to happen. And that was it. They kept saying, hang around a little bit longer on Kingdom of the Sun. And then eventually the producer, Randy Fulmer, said, well, we'd like you to be head of story. As much as I wanted to go work on Sweating Bullets, I thought I can't pass up a leadership role because someday I was hoping to be able to direct at Disney. So that was something that they really wanted to see at the time, is that you had leadership skills before you became a director. So I knew that was kind of a step in that process. So I couldn't say no. I took it and never regretted it because I had such a blast working on Emperor's New Groove. And it was a crazy production. It was like a year and a half from start to finish, which is kind of unheard of. But it was so much fun, and I'm so proud of having worked on that movie. I'd expressed interest in directing after Emperor's New Groove. The head of development at the time said, we'd like you to do another leadership role before we give you a directing position. So I did Brother Bear. Yeah, I had relocated to Florida for about a year and a half for Brother Bear because I was also head of story on that movie. And I remember there was even some real loose talk of, well, maybe if Robinson's gets a green light, you could send it down to Florida. We could make it down there because I had that relationship with that studio, but needless to say that didn't happen. And so I'd say it might have been 8-9 months into developing Robinson's that they closed the Florida studio. And that was very sad. I was so happy that I got a chance to be down there because it was a really wonderful studio and a wonderful group of people, so passionate, just so proud of what they did down there. But it was really sad when it went away. I know a lot of people were really devastated. You know, obviously Pixar was beating the pants off of us at the box office, so that was becoming a big deal. Then I remember while we were working on Brother Bear, then Shrek came out, and that was huge. And then DreamWorks kind of shifted totally to CG. But I guess I never thought it would damage hand-drawn animation, I guess. I always felt like, well, there's room for both. So I think I was a little surprised when we kind of went, all or nothing into CG. I think I always hoped that we could have both. Even the perception, certainly with the management of Disney, was that all the movies that were making the money were computer animated, and our movies that were hand-drawn were not doing as well. So in typical kind of Hollywood reactive executive fashion, they said, well, then it must be the medium and not the subject matter. For the most part, we all kind of operate under I don't know if it's foolish or if it's or what, but we sort of operate under this sense that, well, there's always going to be a Disney animation. Somehow, some way, in some form, there's going to be a Disney animation. It just seems kind of hard to imagine that there wouldn't be, but there have been times where it almost went away. So I think since I've been there, it's felt to me like it's been a little more stable, but then sometimes you hear these stories that during the time you thought everything was stable, it was actually really unstable, and people were talking about closing it down. So I suppose the truth of the matter is that anything can go away at any moment, and so something you always have to be prepared for. And during Brother Bear, during the last year of Brother Bear, I started developing something on the side with two creative executives at the time who were good friends. And they asked me if I'd be interested in just developing a project, sort of as a director. I did that a little bit on the side through the last year of Brother Bear. And then when I came back to LA, the studio said, well, if you'd be willing to put that other thing on hold, we have this script here that we'd love you to read and see if it's something you'd be interested in doing. Now, that script was obviously A Day with Wilbur Robinson. It was developed by the same two creative executives that I worked with on Brother Bear, and they had developed a script with a writer on their own, and then handed it to me. I was just a few pages in, and I was like, well, I have to do this movie because it was the story of a boy who is looking to find his birth mother. And little did the studio know that I was adopted and that I understood this kid's struggle and this kid's, longing to fill that void of who created me and where are they and why did they give me away. I had lived with those questions for so much of my life. I went back to the head of development and I said, absolutely, I have to do this, whatever it takes. I'm going to make this movie, or at least make it as far as you'll let me make it. I mean, we still were really interested in making a Disney movie, but we liked the idea of kind of thinking, is there a way to make a Disney movie that doesn't play a lot of the same notes that most Disney movies play? I mean, a time travel movie, contemporary setting, we hadn't done a lot of those. So kind of that mix of science fiction, doing a little broader comedy, and the idea of having like a twist at the end. So I think we were just trying to see what we could do. Like, could we push the boundaries a little bit? Could some of the humor be a little more, Looney Tunes versus Disney? Those aspects of it felt kind of exciting. Like, well, maybe we could do a little quirkier Disney film, but still have the hearts. But again, not really setting out to say we're going to subvert Disney. It was just more of, hey, there's a lot of things that we're all influenced by that we like as much as Disney. Maybe we could pull some of that tone in there. And I always said, the first act is a Disney movie, and then the second act with the Robinsons is more of a Looney Tunes cartoon, because the Robinsons are much more like Looney Tunes. They get in your face, they touch you and grab you and pull you and yank you, and they move quicker. Their timing is much snappier. Or like Blur, that guy has those blur frames that, Chuck Jones would do those a lot. And so kind of like bringing different influences in just seemed like a fun idea. There's always moments where people start saying sincerely, like, we'll just have to keep moving forward, and then they catch themselves and they kind of keep moving forward, and they kind of grin at you and you go, yeah, whatever. But for the most part, it was very inspiring. It's not all the time that as a director you have your theme so early. Sometimes you have a theme early and then it changes as the movie evolves, or sometimes you know what your story is and your characters, but you don't quite know what it all means, and then you discover that as you go along. We were really lucky to have a statement that felt organic to the concept, organic to the characters, and that felt universal and actually applicable to anybody. It's just a sort of a kind of common human thing of the idea of perseverance and, looking ahead rather than looking behind. Everybody got that. I felt really lucky as a director that I could always get up in front of any kind of group, be it a group of people that worked on the movie. It could be different divisions of the company that we were rolling the movie out to for their support. It could be press, but I could get up in front of people and say, this is what our movie's about, and everybody got it, and everybody felt that it was true. There was value in that statement and embracing that statement. And I tell you, I still to this day I'm very honored about this, but I mean, I still get snail mail, I get messenger messages or emails of people that say that theme really connected with me and it got me out of a tough spot. That's why we do what we do, is to connect to people. And so when you get that kind of feedback and continue to get that feedback 11 years later, that's really, I'm really proud of that. So yeah, it's pretty cool. I probably had read that quote before, but I never put it together. And then after a couple of years living with those three words, and then reading that quote, I was kind of floored. So we had a bulletin board in our production pod. So I pinned it to the bulletin board and circled it on this piece of paper that I'd read it. And just was like, wow, that's really neat. And then Don Hahn, who was still at the studio at the time and was kind of helping out in development on various projects, he would come in and work with us every now and then. When Don Hahn read the quote, he said, you've got to put that at the end of the movie. And so we did. And a lot of people think that we based it on the quote, but we had it and then found the quote. But it was really special. So many people have also really responded to that and found that very, very moving, that we could end with Walt Disney's words. There's a lot of elements in the movie that are very Walt Disney to me. Maybe not necessarily the final design of the future city, but some of our earlier passes of the house, the Robinson house and the future city, were much more kind of inspired by the classic Tomorrowland from the 60s and 70s, or like Epcot from the early years of Epcot. I love the feeling of those places, the feeling of progress and a very hopeful future. Walt was such a futurist, and so I'd always thought about those connections. But when we found that quote, kind of put it all together, it was a good synthesis of all that. On the one hand, I was directing a Disney feature film for the first time. I directed television in the past, but never a feature. The newness of that and kind of the overwhelming feeling of that. But then on top of it, it was in CG, which I knew nothing about. So I had to kind of get a crash course in just what it all means. The great thing was that the crew that we had, most of them had worked on Dinosaur and, you know, a lot of the CG from like Treasure Planet, that kind of stuff, some of the hybrid CG that we'd used. And they were great, and they were so willing to share. And I never felt like if I said, I don't know what's going on, can you please tell me what you're talking about, that they would take advantage of that or see it as a weakness or somehow a vulnerability in me. I felt very safe that I could just say, what does any of that mean? I don't know what we're doing. And they would just explain it. So yeah, I kind of had to have a crash course once we went into production on Robinsons. But then also, there were a lot of 2D animators that did stay and did get trained in CG. What was a little difficult about it was that some were more successful than others, and I know that some of them really, 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 really struggled, and I felt so bad for them because I knew how great they were. There was one guy in particular, I remember, he was animating on Meet the Robinsons. Amazing animator. I feel like I don't really want to say his name, but we walked into his office at one point, and he was just like, his nose was almost right up against the glass of his monitor, and he just had the most pained expression on his face. And he said, I just feel like somebody cut my hands off, and I'm asked to animate. Like, he just said, I just don't know how to do this. There was so many things that you couldn't do, and coming from 2D animation, there's really nothing you can't do unless you as an animator can't draw it. You know, if a character is going to, I don't know, do some really crazy expression, you just draw that. But in CG, if you don't have it rigged to do that, the model rigged to do that, you can't do it. And also at the time, you know, things hadn't quite evolved to where they are now. So there was just a lot of, we can't really do that, or, you know, you can't get somebody wet, or you can't run fingers through somebody's hair because that's really difficult to get the geometry through the hair that you've grown, all kinds of things like that, like interacting with fabric and things that have all been solved now. It was odd to sort of have that limitation because it always felt to me like hand-drawn animation was just sort of limitless. And those first 3.5 years were so tough with David Staten, the then head of animation, and some of the other leadership. It was just a fight just to kind of protect the movie from being totally dismantled or just made into something that none of us would have been proud of. We all really believed in what we were trying to say, and so much of the feedback and the notes and things that we were getting from leadership had nothing to do with making the story better. It was all about how to make it more commercial. Or it was, oh, Monday morning we come in and Shark Tale had opened over the weekend and it did huge, and it's got big name celebrities. So, and that did really well. So we got to cast all big name celebrities and Meet the Robinsons now. We got to change all the casting. We got to fire all the actors and change them. Or people seeing a color script hung up in the hallway and saying, you know, there's too much brown in the movie. I don't like the color brown. Sit down and have a meeting about the color script again, even though it was already approved weeks ago. So it was all that stupid stuff that didn't have anything to do with making the movie better. It was just, everything was just a reaction to what everybody else outside of our walls were doing. And if they had a success, then we will have a success if we copy that. I'm not saying that I want to make avant-garde movies that don't make any money. I get where I work and I get what we do. But, you know, I do believe in John's philosophy that quality is the best business plan, as he would always say first couple of years when he came to Disney. And what was most important is if we make a good movie, that's going to do really well. So we just kept trying to make the movie better, and everybody else just tried to make it, I guess, what they felt was more commercial or would make it sell better or whatever. I pushed back a lot on David, and when we were first trying to figure out our relationship, I tried different tactics, and some people told me, well, you gotta just sort of go in the room and yell at David. And so I tried that, and that didn't work. And then people say, you gotta be really nice, and so I tried all these different ways, and then eventually I would just speak my mind as best as I could. But I'm not a confrontational person. I try to speak my mind, but do it professionally, do it diplomatically, do it constructively. So I'm not like a yeller and a screamer, which wouldn't have worked with David anyways. I mean, he just never would have gotten anywhere. One of the sort of rumors that we'd heard about David Staten is that Eisner put David in place because he wanted David to spy on Roy and knew that David was somebody he could use to do that. So that was kind of going on in that early stages of Robinson's. I mean, Michael was much more involved back then when David was in charge because, frankly, I think David was a little nervous about making any kind of huge decisions without Michael's blessing. The only involvement I remember with Roy on Robinson's was that he had come to one of the screenings, but his only note was, well, that would make a really good TV show. And I never really knew what that meant. If he just meant because it should be a TV show instead of a movie, or it would make a really good, spun off into a TV show project. I was never quite sure what that meant, but that was the only involvement that I have any recollection of Roy having with Robinson's.
Dear Michael. Those two words would change Disney's history. The words began a letter from Roy Disney to Chairman Michael Eisner, detailing how Michael Eisner was destroying his uncle's company. It was Roy's second revolt. His first ousted his cousin-in-law, Ron Miller, and replaced him with a young upstart Michael Eisner back in the 1980s. And now that rendezvous had also reached its end. The letter read, Dear Michael, it is with deep sadness and regret that I send you this letter of resignation from the Walt Disney Company, both as chairman of the Feature Animation Division and vice chairman of the Board of Directors. You well know that you and I have had serious differences of opinion about the direction and style of management in the company in recent years. For whatever reason, you have driven a wedge between me and those I work with, even to the extent of requiring some of my associates to report my conversations and activities back to you. I find this intolerable. Finally, you discussed with the nominating committee of the Board of Directors its decision to leave my name off the slate of directors to be elected in the coming year, effectively muzzling my voice on the board, much as you did with Andrea Vandekamp last year. Michael, I believe your conduct has resulted from my clear and unambiguous statements to you and the Board of Directors that after 19 years at the helm, you are no longer the best person to run the Walt Disney Company. You had a very successful first 10-plus years at the company in partnership with Frank Wells, for which I salute you. But since Frank's untimely death in 1994, the company has lost its focus, its creative energy, and its heritage. As I have said, and as Stanley Gold has documented in letters to you and other members of the board, this company, under your leadership, has failed during the last 7 years in many ways. 1. The failure to bring back ABC Primetime from the ratings abyss it has been in for years, and your inability to program successfully the ABC Family Channel. Both of these failures have had, and I believe will continue to have, significant adverse impact on shareholder value. 2. Your consistent micromanagement of everyone around you, with the resulting loss of morale throughout this company. 3. The timidity of your investments in our theme park business. At Disney's California Adventure, Paris, and now in Hong Kong, you have tried to build parks on the cheap, and they show it, and the attendance figures reflect it. 4. The perception by all of our stakeholders, consumers, investors, employees, distributors, and suppliers that this company is rapacious, soulless, and always looking for the quick buck, rather than long-term value, which is leading to a loss of public trust. 5. The creative brain drain of the last several years, which is real and continuing, and damages our company with the loss of every talented employee. 6. Your failure to establish and build constructive relationships with creative partners, especially Pixar, Miramax, and cable companies distributing our products. 7. Your consistent refusal to establish a clear succession plan. In conclusion, Michael, it is my sincere belief that it is you who should be leaving, and not me. Accordingly, I once again call for your resignation or retirement. The Walt Disney Company deserves fresh, energetic leadership at this challenging time in its history, just as we did in 1984, when I headed a restructuring which resulted in your recruitment to the company. I have and will always have an enormous allegiance and respect for this company, founded by my Uncle Walt and Father Roy, and to our faithful employees and loyal stockholders. I don't know if you and other directors can comprehend how painful it is for me and the extended Disney family to arrive at this decision. In accordance with Item 6 of Form 8K and Item 7 of Schedule 14A, I request that you disclose this letter and that you file a copy of this letter as an exhibit to Company Form 8K. With sincerest regret, Roy E. Disney. That was in 2003. In March 2004, there was a shareholders meeting with the purpose of removing Michael Eisner. The Guardian described the meeting as follows. Mr. Gold said, "This is an unprecedented no-confidence vote in the annals of American business. Our message has resonated loud and clear. No excuses, no half measures, no amount of spinning will be tolerated. Shareholders have spoken too clearly. Michael Eisner must leave now." Mr. Disney appealed to the sentiment. Management was betraying an authentic American icon. Returning to the stage, Mr. Eisner responded, "Thank you, Roy. Thank you, Stanley. That was a joy." He described the comments as rhetoric that replaces reason. The vote came in and 43% of the shareholders did not support Eisner. And just like that, he was no longer chairman. 21 years at Disney, gone. He had helped the company grow from a sleeping beauty to a ferocious, synergistic giant. In that time, he had become the face of the company, putting himself front and center at Walt's position as the host of the wonderful world of Disney. Despite all his success and failures, there was no grand celebration for Eisner's leaving. He had become persona non grata. He would be replaced by Bob Iger, who would help take Disney to its highest heights with the intellectual roundup of properties like Marvel, Pixar, and Star Wars. Disney would quickly set about fixing its problems with Pixar. On January 25, 2006, it would buy Pixar for $7.4 billion. Steve Jobs would become the largest shareholder in Disney. David Staten lost his position as president of feature animation, and John Lasseter became the chief creative officer of Disney Animation and Pixar Animation. This was long before John would be removed from that post at Disney in disgrace after sexual harassment in 2018, which Lasseter would refer to as, quote, missteps. But in 2006, he was a conquering hero, a returning knight to a company that had fired him in the 1980s. And now, in an unbelievable, impossible reversal of fortunes, Disney was coming to him with their tail between their legs.
When David was out and John was in, from what I remember, it was just sort of euphoria because things were difficult during the pre-John, pre-Pixar acquisition time. And the excitement was, oh my gosh, we've got somebody in charge of Disney who's a filmmaker, not an executive. And everybody, I think, was just so stoked for that. The weird little irony is that the day that the announcement came that David was out and John was in was the day of our first audience preview. and that went well. So it was one of those days that was just felt like nothing can get better than this day. We got rid of David, we got John Lasseter in charge, and we had a really good audience preview. The audience enjoyed our movie. The focus group was very positive. Our scores, from what we were told, were very good. The first notes meeting we had with the Pixar group, it was the Disney Story Trust at the time, and then it was the Pixar Brain Trust, and we were all together. It was a 6-hour note session, and halfway through, the group started basically outlining a totally different movie. We took a break, and I went back to my office, and I said to myself, well, this is your last day on the movie, because I can't make that movie that they're pitching up there. I don't believe in it. I'm not interested in doing it. I'll just write out this meeting, and then I will back away, and I'll say, thank you, I'm not going to make this movie anymore. But I do have to hand it to John. At the end of that day, as hard as that day was, he cleared the room, and he just kept myself and Dorothy McKim, producer, and Don Hall, who was our head of story at the time. It was John and Ed Catmull. And John said, okay, you've heard all these notes. Now, this is our way of working. So now it's up to you guys, the team, to go away and go through all the notes and pick out the ones that will make your movie better, and then bring those back and we'll talk about those. Because what I was concerned about was, at the end of the day, they were going to have re-outlined the whole movie, and then they'd say, here you go make that movie now. That's the movie you're going to make. And I couldn't do that. But he didn't say that. He empowered us to find the notes that are going to make your movie better and use those and push all the other ones to the side. So we were able to do that, and he was very happy with the way we approached that, and so then we were able to continue. But there was a moment there where I thought, this is it, I'm done. So, yeah. I mean, speaking frankly, it was a really tough time because they came in about 3.5 years into the production. Those 3.5 years prior to John coming in, I felt like I'd fought and fought and fought and fought and fought, and not just me, Dorothy McKim, our producer, all of the leadership on our movie, everybody believed in the movie so much, and everybody was so supportive and just rallied around the movie that we all just fought and fought and fought to try to protect the movie and keep its integrity intact. So by the time John came in, I was exhausted from fighting, and now I found myself having to fight more because I was getting a lot of big notes from the Pixar group and from John. Not that they were bad notes if it were 3 years earlier, but given the fact of where we were, a lot of the notes were making a totally different movie, and I just wasn't going to do that. But I was so exhausted and beaten from 3 years prior, and I was so intimidated by Pixar. I've got John Lasseter, I've got Andrew Stanton, I've got Pete Docter. There was one screening we had Brad Bird in there giving us notes. This is an intimidating group. I don't even know I don't know if I can push back. Whether they would listen or not is sort of even kind of immaterial. I just didn't have the confidence. Like, who am I to be sitting here telling Pixar people that I know better than they are? So it was this mixture of, I just don't want to fight anymore, coupled with, I don't feel like I am worthy to stand up to you guys. So there was a lot of stuff that happened in that final year of the movie that, looking back at a lot of it now, I wish that I would have really stood up for it. Because some things I think got better, some things I think just got different. I do think other versions we had better ideas that unfortunately didn't stick. I just wish I would have had the confidence to really push back, but I was just really kind of, I'd been through the ringer already. I'm not trying to, be woe is me or anything, but it had been tough. And so I was doing the best I could to kind of make it through that last hurdle. I have to thank John for not just coming in and killing it. I suppose there's already been too much money spent on it at that point, so he probably the company or the studio wouldn't have let him kill it, but he could have. I mean, he could have come in and just said, you know what, this has David's smell all over it, and I'm just going to get rid of this movie. Could have done that, which luckily he didn't. I think we were 80% animated after John and the gang weighed in on the movie. Then we redid about 60% of that 80% animation. There were some bumpy moments, but looking back on it, remembering meetings with John, as we were finishing up the movie, and then he was then part of looking at animation and looking at final shots, all that kind of stuff. He He did try to be collaborative. I do feel like he tried to partner with me as much as possible. But I think for the most part, I still felt like we were making our movie. I think he did believe in parts of what we were doing, or kind of elements of the movie. I do remember the first day, that first audience preview, and then when David was out, the day after that was when we first met John and Ed. And so John was asking me about the project, and then I kind of told my personal story about being adopted, that kind of thing. And he definitely responded to that. And I remember hearing him say a few times that he really appreciated the fact that there was a personal connection that I had to this material. So I think that was the thing that kind of kept him engaged. I wonder if I didn't have a connection to it, it may have been totally different. But I think he did have respect for that personal connection, because that's so important to them up at Pixar, and they brought that down to us at Disney too, the filmmakers having that connection to the material. The amazing thing is that through everything that happened on that movie, the theme for the movie on our very first screening was Keep Moving Forward, and the theme for the movie that was released in theaters was Keep Moving Forward. We were able to at least keep the sentiment, the statement that we wanted to make, and the basic story, the basic beats of the story are pretty much intact. Now, some people might say that's not something to brag about, because that means if your first idea is in the final version, then you probably didn't dig deep enough and work those out. But there's something about it to me that I feel proud of, I think because of all the storms we had to weather, and the fact that we were able to maintain somehow the movie we wanted to make from the very beginning. And I feel proud of that. One of the most emotional moments of the movie was sitting at the El Capitan Theater in Hollywood at the premiere next to my mother watching the movie. And certainly the scene towards the end where Louis goes back to the orphanage and has that ability to reconnect with his mother and chooses not to. I remember watching the film and I could hear my mother next to me crying. And so then, of course, I lost it and started crying as well. But it was very moving to be able to be there next to my parents, not just because of the achievement of it all, but then also because of the adoption angle of stuff, and just how fortunate I have been to have been adopted into this family that I'm a part of, and how loving and supportive it's been. And it was just very special.